Good evening from Nairobi. My name is Candice Jumwa, a junior mining engineer at the Impact Facility. It is my pleasure to moderate this session, which is a side session of the 14th OECD Forum for Responsible Mineral Supply Chain. Our webinar today is titled The Lake Victoria Gold Program, Professionalizing Artisanal and Small-Scale Gold Mining. A couple of pointers before we start. We do hope that our session is going to be an interactive session. Please make sure to use the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom to submit any questions that you might have. We'll respond to as many questions as we might be able to. If not, we'll follow up via email next week. The session will also be recorded for your own convenience, and you'll be able to get a copy of it. Without further ado, allow me to introduce the Lake Victoria Gold Program. Having begun in 2021, our consortium will be working together until at the very least till the end of 2024. The Lake Victoria Gold Program sets out to improve working conditions of ASM miners in East Africa and create structures to ensure fair payment for their gold. Leveraging previous projects and lessons dating back to as far back as 2012 by some of our consortium members, we have designed our program around these three key aspects. We have access to capacity development, which will be led by Solidaridad East and Central Africa. We have access to capital and equipment, which will be led by my colleagues at the Impact Facility. And we also have access to market, which will be a collaborative effort between the Chambers Federation, Fairphone, and Fairtrade Foundation. It is my pleasure to be working on this project with a few of my colleagues, some of whom are with me today. And on the panelists today, we have Gassom Aligera, who is the Impact Innovation Fund Manager at Fairford. We have Joshua Rukundo, who's the Senior Project Officer at Solidaridad East and Central Africa. Specifically, he's based in Uganda. We have Matthew Chambers, who's the chairman of the Chambers Federation, and we have David Stamis, who's the director of program and operations at TIFF Kenya. So, with this, I am delighted to with this, we hope that through this session, we'll be able to share some of the challenges and lessons from our past and show you how we will be able to use those lessons in our approach working with ASM communities in Kenya and Uganda specifically. To give you a background, the Lake Victoria Gold Program consists of a consortium of partners who have mentioned, and it is my pleasure to be handing over to one of our panelists, who is Gassom Aliegra Ferrufino. Thank you. Gassom, welcome.
Thank you so much, Candice, and yeah, thanks everyone for attending this session. So as a first point in the agenda, we want to drive, let's say, on what is it that downstream actors such as, for example, Fairphone or any other participant in the electronics industry should engage with problems that are found at upstream, and why, for example, Fairphone is engaged in this project, and why do we engage with issues that are arising all the way upstream, very far away from our direct suppliers, is because Fairphone truly believes that end users, and in this case downstream actors, do have a very important role to play in driving change at the sourcing level of whatever materials they are consuming. So Fairphone takes this idea from the perspective of implementing our fair sourcing principles, which are the ones that you see here in front of you. So the first one would be the use of the buying power as a catalyst for investment. The fact that Fairphone, like any other industry actor, does consume and does have commercial relationships with certain actors in the supply chain. In this case, for the Lake Victoria project, would be gold. And we can indeed, use this buying power in order for driving change. And I'll just give a quick example in the next slides about how we do that. Then once again, looking at the issues at the sourcing level, we decide to take all the risks that are associated, let's say, with ISM mining, and we change them into opportunities. What does this mean is, let's not just focus on how, you know, engaging at this level will affect, let's say, our brand, but rather look at the fact that ISM mining is, for instance, a very important source of livelihood for many people, and how can we play a role into improving that source of livelihood, and how can we actually make lives better. That translates directly into the third point of achieving continuous improvement. So all the risks that we identify are certain aspects where we see opportunities for improvement, and we decide not to wait to the point in which, let's say, gold from ISM material is already certified or is already, you know, let's say, presented in the most perfect fashion, but rather let's engage with this. Let's engage with ISM mining at a point in which they themselves also agree to engage in a continuous improvement path, and let's reward that by engaging commercially with these actors as well, in a way in which we put our side of, you know, using our buying power, at the same time they put their side as to commit to this continuous improvement. And yeah, the fourth principle would be about working towards systemic change. So we are engaging into projects and into ideas that are designed to be scalable and replicable, not just, let's say, as an independent project that will shine but will be impossible to implement in other supply chains, but rather in a system that is really scalable, and it's an example for the entire industry to take up as a way forward. If we can move to the next slide, then we can say how did Fairphone did this. In our particular case, we analyzed and looked at our supply chain. In this case, taking the example of ISM Gold, we identified who in our supply chain was engageable. How is gold finishing or ending up in our product, and who do we need to engage in this supply chain in order to bring responsible material into our own product. In order to do this, we reach out to our supply chain, and then we did bring on board, for example, our PCB, our camera supplier, our speaker, and our battery connector suppliers, all of these being different companies engaged in our supply chain. And we did bring them on board through a mass balance system in which we did connect basically a responsible source of gold. And through the mass balance system, this material ended up in our phone, passing through, of course, all of these different actors along the chain. Why is it that the company, of course, beyond, let's say, the immediate impact that you could have doing this kind of activity on the ground, why would any other actor want to engage in this? Fairphone sees two very important reasons for this. Of course, there are many more, but let's say two relevant ones are the fact that there is an increasing consumer expectation about, you know, products doing good or doing more good than doing bad, and we see this trend, of course, in things like certified fair trade products in the supermarket. The fact that, you know, bio products are increasing, and this is then again not slowly translating into areas such as the electronics. And Fairphone is a vivid example of a successful company that is growing in a market that has, you know, a lot of competition, but clients and consumers are increasingly being more conscious about what is behind their products, and they are demanding that their products are doing good. So that is something important to take into account. And the second aspect is that by engaging in projects such as the one that we're presenting here today, we are assembling a system in which, you know, essentially we're not offering just an example to follow, but we're also offering a system that will allow companies in time to also be able to much easily and in a much more economic fashion be able to comply with current conflict mineral regulation and due diligence legislation, as well as the upcoming ones in the future. So these, I think, are two important aspects to take into account if you are into the downstream sector. as to why you would rather engage with ISM goals at this point in time, and look at the opportunities at the source and engage with them. Yeah. So I think that's all from my side. Thank you. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Garso. Next, we'll be having Joshua Rukundo, who's the Senior Project Officer, Solidaridad Uganda. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you, Candice. My name is Joshua Rukundo, as I've been introduced, and I'm going to be talking about the particular needs that artisanal and small-scale gold miners face and how we envision the Lake Victoria Gold Program will address them. One of the main needs that ASM faces is limited access to finance, limited access to equipment. Two of those two main points will be elaborated further by David later on in this session. They also face a challenge with skills development, whereby almost all the workers they have are working with the skills that they learned on the job, either through observation or any other informal means. There is also a challenge of organizational capacity development. They have issues to do with record keeping, basic administration of their organizations. And then there is a limited access to reliable markets. We all know that most ASM gold is, at the first point, is sold either through a middleman or a local trader, who eventually sells it to a larger trader and a larger trader until it reaches the refiner. And then there's also another challenge of limited access to geological information and regulations and policies that don't necessarily favor artisanal miners. We envision addressing some of these challenges. For example, skills development. In the program, there is a portion for capacity development for the mines. We'll have some targeted trainings to do with, for example, mature waste management. We'll have support for organization development. There's one of our partners is a gold off-taker, so they'll basically take on the mantle of designing a route to market for ASM gold. And then through our support for their processes of legalization and formalization, we envision helping them get access to geological information, considering that in the space that they're working in, them as artisanal miners, the only way they can have access to this is when they're fully formalized. Have the next slide, please. So over the years, we've learned some lessons with the gold supply chain. The first and most important lesson being that artisanal and small-scale mining is a very complex sector with many players, all the way from the miners themselves, the middlemen, who also happen to be financiers and traders within the mining communities, equipment suppliers. The quality of the equipment that they supply in most artisanal and small-scale mining communities is debatable, but there are also players and very serious players in that space. The most pressing need for most ASM miners we've observed is at the production phase, where with the fact that they're informal and there is low mechanization, the operation ends up being very capital intensive. Right now, there is a debate in Uganda of classifying what qualifies to be as an artisanal mine, because according to the mining law that is still working, an artisanal and small-scale mine is one that is the kind of license that they can apply for is one where they don't invest more than 10 million Uganda shillings. But we have artisanal mines that are hiring excavators and using all this heavy equipment, clearly showing that they're investing much more than the prevailing law is allowing them to. We also learned that local traders and the middlemen, so to say, are all mostly willing to purchase smaller unrefined quantities of gold as compared to other international and mainstream buyers. And they don't wait, they don't have a precondition of bulking for the miners. So it's easier for miners to sell to their local traders than, for example, to bulk a kilo of gold and sell it to an international buyer. Also to note is that most traceability mechanisms are not yet strong enough to avoid contamination of the supply chain. Uganda being next door to Congo, we have garnered a bad reputation for contaminating the gold supply chain with conflict gold and illegal gold from the Congo. Then we have also noted that refiners play a big role in due diligence. But according to some stakeholders, they feel that too much of the due diligence burden has been imposed on refiners, and the feel is that it should spread more upstream and downstream than leaving most of it to the refiners, who basically need to prove to a jeweler that the gold that they are selling to them has been responsibly sourced. And according to the World Gold Council, it is envisioned that demand for ASM gold is going to increase, but there's a disparity within different areas. For example, sections of refiners say that the demand for the ASM gold is higher than the supply. However, some sections of ASM miners actually say that they can't find buyers for their responsible gold. So it's a bit of a paradox. Can you have the next slide, please? And the benefits and incentives for ASMs to participate in sustainable supply chains. We have the usual ones. The usual ones we development partners keep telling ASMs. Of course, there are some ASMs in the region that have already experienced this, an increase in demand for responsibly produced ASM gold, improved access to finance and investment, increased visibility. We know that once, for example, you sell a batch of gold to Fairphone, with the trend of social media and the likes, Fairphone will always sing praises to your name. I'm giving an example, just some. There's also a benefit of increased relationships between communities and the mines. Most mines that you visit right now, you find that there is a love-hate relationship between the miners and how they operate and the community. In Busia, where we've been working in Tira, you find cases of water being pumped from mines and let to run off in the road. Cases of pits being opened and left open within the community. So with, of course, a sustainable supply chain will have to get miners to improve their practices, among which will be occupational health and safety, and improving how they plan and place their mines within communities. The incentives include access to fair and transparent payment systems based on the international price. Right now, the way it is that a middleman will basically determine the price of gold. For example, during COVID in Busia, there's a time when the price went down and then abruptly the price went back up. So most of the time, middlemen in mining communities determine these prices. But when miners are involved in sustainable supply chains, the price will rarely vary from the international price. There's also an incentive of them possibly securing long-term business partnerships and purchasing guarantees. Of course, this comes with a responsibility to them to make sure that they keep up the end of the bargain, to make sure they have the quantities in place and following traceability guidelines to make sure that they don't contaminate their buyers' supply chains, and to improve the social and economic well-being of their communities. There is a possibility of them accessing affordable pre-finance. Right now, it's financing artisanal mining is a bit of a challenge. Most banks don't want to, so miners end up being at the mercy of money lenders and and middlemen. Of course, that comes with complicated conditions. In Busia, it's common for a middleman to finance a mining operation, and then the rule is they have to sell whatever they get to him, where he ends up first of all deducting whatever he lent them with interest, and then leaving them the peanuts of what he has bought from them. Then there is also an incentive of a consolidated supply chain with less intermediary traders, which has an advantage of increasing the price that they get at the start. Because, for example, if I'm a middleman and I have to sell the gold to someone else who has to sell it to someone else who has to sell it to someone else, I'm not going to give you a good price now, because I also have to sell it to someone else who's supposed to give me a better price than the one I'm giving you. Yeah, so far that's from me. I submit.
So before we move on to the next panelist, I had a few questions for Mr. Joshua and Mr. Gasson. So Joshua, for you, I have two questions. How can we ensure that women in ASM, who are oftentimes the ones that are underpaid and in direct contact with mercury, reached by the LVGP's interventions? And secondly, what do you think from your experience in the past motivates miners to see the need for coming to the trainings that you've held in the past? And for Mr. Gasson, the question I would pose to you is, given that Fairphone has been engaged in the gold industry for a few years now, how do you communicate about your risks and challenges that you have encountered up to this point? Joshua, would you like to start?
Yes, I'll start with the second question. What motivates miners to see the need for training? So first and foremost, artisanal mining, in its sense, in its very, very characteristic, is the end game is to get gold out of the ground and sell it. So you find that it is always a challenge. First of all, I have to admit that it is always a challenge to get miners to a training session, especially during the dry season, which is funny. Mining also has weather. During the dry season, where the mines are dry and activities are high, it's very hard to get them to a training session. But we've noticed over the years, that they'll usually attend a training session, first of all, if there is promise of an incentive at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. For example, during the child labor project that recently ended, one of the things that motivated them the most was the promise of them receiving the equipment. So we noted that there were faces that were consistent in all the training sessions, and the testimonies from them were that they needed to learn as much as possible, because they didn't want a scenario of equipment arriving and they are handicapped and they don't have the necessary skills to apply when using the equipment. We also found out that there are those that genuinely come to the training sessions to seek new knowledge. Usually those are the youth, the ones that have just entered the mining spaces and eager to learn something new from what their parents have been doing. And then there is always the question of what new skill are you bringing, you as the trainer or as the entity that is facilitating the training. What new skill are you bringing, and how is it eventually going to translate into them increasing their productivity? Because most miners, that's the main thing that they are concerned with, increasing productivity, with the understanding that it eventually translates into an improved income. Then the other question on how we can ensure that women are reached by our interventions. It's known that the main challenge that women face in ASM communities regarding to mining is that they don't control the resources. The most important resource being land, that is usually controlled by the men. It's the same challenge that youth also face. And even when they're involved in the mining, they're usually not involved in the most profitable roles. You hardly ever find a woman being in charge of collecting the gold to bulk it into a kilo. You usually find the women crushing ore, panning, and ore sluicing, which inadvertently leaves them exposed to toxins like mercury. So the first would be a targeted approach, maybe considering skills development for the particular roles that women are involved with. If you notice that for a given artisanal and small scale mining organization, most of the women there are involved in crushing ore, maybe you can target an intervention that leads towards an improvement in that skill, or adding technology to that particular role to make their work more efficient. Then the other approach would be to target women-led or women mining groups. It's very rare to find women mining groups in Uganda, but I know it's work that we have done in Tanzania under the Golden Line project. And it garnered a lot of attention because the interventions that were targeted towards these women mining groups had a ripple effect over into the communities that they were working in. The other and more complicated approach would be to have proactive engagement with the men, because most of these issues, most of the gender-related issues in mining cannot be solved when we target only the women. It has to be an approach that includes the men and the youth, to jointly come up with solutions for the particular challenges they are facing. The challenges that women face, women involved in artisanal mining in Busia and, for example, Geita, may be similar, but there are some of those specific challenges to particular communities that can't be solved with the general approach. And actually need a particular targeted approach with community engagement. I submit.
Thank you, Joshua. And now on to Gasom.
Yeah, I'll be very brief here. So about how do we communicate about the risks in our supply chain, and let's say the lessons learned. So in the one hand, I think our first step of Fairphone, thinking about our consumers, but also many times thinking about our own suppliers, is simply bringing awareness about, how us ourselves and us as an industry are sometimes directly or indirectly connected to the issues at IFM. So of course, bringing and raising awareness about the challenges and the issues at the upstream level is the first step, and that is actually one of the funding let's say that is one of the reasons why Fairphone started. Fairphone started as an awareness campaign and only later transformed into a company, because we want to not just point the finger at what is wrong in the industry, but also be able to experiment, learn, and also offer potential solutions and alternatives to the industry. But nonetheless, one of the issues is bringing awareness, because our own consumers many times are not even aware that there's minerals in the phone, or that there's gold in the phone, and that potentially there is material in the phone that is stemming from places from which they would not necessarily be comfortable with. Let's say talking about conflict minerals, talking about child labor in supply chains, etc., etc. So awareness is one key part, and the second way in which we communicate things is, okay, once people are aware that there are all these problems, then we go back to our sourcing principles and we transform all these risks into opportunities. We make people aware that the fact that by them, let's say, if a consumer is supporting Fairphone by buying one of our products, that Fairphone is indeed looking at ways in which we can address all these issues on the ground. And hence we turn the message into what opportunities is this bringing. We inform people openly about, where we are engaging, what we're doing in these issues, how we hope that we can affect them positively. And then we update them regularly about how much progress we have done into the programs when we are engaged. Of course, when issues such as, for example, child labor are on the table, it is very, very difficult to show a whole bunch of progress from, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 years down the line, because of course, if child labor was solvable in such period of time, we wouldn't be talking about it today in this context. But nonetheless, having a proactive attitude towards communicating progress, communicating what we're doing, and as well as being honest about, where we failed and what we learned is also important. For instance, now we are at the end of our program in Uganda related to child labor in artisanal gold mining. We just finished an evaluation of this project, and we will be hoping to be publishing the results openly and sharing, what it is that went well and what it is that didn't go as well. So all in all, being open, raising awareness, and then again, turning all these risks into the opportunities, and how everybody in the chain, whether it is a consumer or a supplier of ours, can also take part into bringing the positive change down the line.
Thank you, Gaso. So if we move on to the next speaker of our session, we have Matthew Chambers, the chairman of the Chambers Federation, who will be addressing access to markets. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Candace. I'll be making several references to different industries, primarily the chocolate industry. I don't think anybody will mind, as everyone likes to hear the words surrounding chocolate. But as David will be discussing investment in the context of this LVGP program and Chambers Federation as an investment firm, let me first provide an introduction to what our role in this program will be. So first, we are a mission-driven organization. We consider impact and social, both economic and social impact first, and our financial return second. We are not a supply chain actor. Rather, we help develop or create local organizations that can meet the compliance standards of the international market. You're not buying from us necessarily. You're instead buying from the local organizations that we're creating. That being said, we're often put in the role of a spokesperson, or in the context of the DRC, we're the importer. There's a withhold release order based on forced labor that's been enacted, where all gold is banned from entering the United States. Of course, we've been granted an exemption to that, the first in US history over 90 years, but that's taken many years to build those compliance systems. So moving on to two questions that I'll be addressing here today. What does responsible sourcing mean to miners? It might not be what you necessarily think. There's obvious where responsible sourcing implies improvements in occupational health and safety standards. This, of course, is our primarily interest and focus would be the reduction in the use of mercury. Especially in this program, the LVGP, and again, this will be something that David will be referring to with potential investments made into upstream production capacity. But so increased revenue. How can miners increase their efficiencies in production so it can increase their revenue in kind? Now, you might think that goal of any program would be also to improve the market price. And of course, in principle, that should always be the case. However, I like to play the devil's advocate role and talking about market price. Most of the areas that we work in, there is significant competition from, you could call them illegal markets, you could call them informal traders, but more often than not, again, in the areas that we have experience in working, they're already paid very, very close to market price. And so while this is something we should always be aware of to ensure that miners are not being exploited, this is gold. And gold is something that is so highly sought after. There are buyers in every corner on the planet. And so focusing more on increasing production efficiencies and generating a greater volume of revenue for miners, I think should be the focus, as they're already quite often receiving very close to market price. In our initial estimates, For the Kenyan market, it's within between 2 to 5% below market price, below LBMA. That's very hard to beat. There are many refiners, international refiners, that will pay out the same. So for them to receive that price locally, it's something very hard to now come into that supply chain and provide additional incentives for miners to sell into a formal market rather than the informal. So the second would be creating local economies and value addition through skilled trade. So this isn't necessarily part of the LVGP, but is part of our programming at Chambers Federation, and it will have indirect ties into the supporting responsible sourcing in the Great Lakes region. So in the DRC, we have a program where we're training women in making jewelry. And we're also starting that same program here in Kenya. So by creating by training people in the skill of jewelry making, we're creating, our intent is not just to create a product to export. The intent is to create domestic markets as well. And now this ties into even COVID-19. And again, now I'm going to give you a reference of the cocoa industry. So during the beginning of the pandemic in the DRC, cocoa exports were brought to a halt. Now this was for two reasons. One was the pandemic itself, and number two was governance and taxation issues. So over 6 months, there were no exports of cocoa. We also have a cocoa program, a chocolate program in the DRC, where we built the first chocolate factory there. And now there's 5 different entrepreneurs who are manufacturing chocolate locally. So during the pandemic, who do you think was the only source of buying during this time of export cessation? So we're creating more resilient local economies by building these supply chains, lowering the carbon footprint even, and creating a stronger local economy that's not as dependent on external market forces. So moving on to some of the challenges. There's a lot of misinformation, just like if we go to Facebook and there's a lot of fake news or misinformation that's being spread around, even in the industry there is as well. And while there are many downstream actors that have good intent and they'd like to source from ASM, sometimes it's not always commercially viable. And so by being very, very transparent from the very beginning, or as soon as you have that information on the numbers and the realistic outlook of what that supply chain might look like and what that end market price might be, it's very important to provide that information very, very quickly. So this is why we've also moved to create value addition locally, because in many markets, the taxation and the general operating costs create a very, very expensive product. And a phrase that we've heard time and time again is gold. And there's no difference from gold from, say, Kenya or Mongolia or Peru or Colombia. I would disagree with that notion a little bit, but if you're a volume buyer, I can definitely understand the frustration. And so analyzing markets, doing a market analysis first, I think is very important if a market access goal is part of any program moving forward. This sector itself, not just the jewelry sector, but anything tied into mining is quite a slow sector to react. Moving into my thoughts and recommendations for things moving forward, I really believe that the more we focus on bringing in new blood, new ideas into this industry, organizations like Fairphone, a great example of this, coming in and showing that, hey, we can do this, we can manufacture a product and we can bring it to market. Again, referencing the chocolate industry. The chocolate industry has a very dark past, a very dark history. And many countries like the Ivory Coast and Ghana are still suffering the consequences of that history. But there's been a dramatic change starting from the grassroots in the craft chocolate industry. And that industry is taking a large chunk of the market share now. And so you see this craft industry that started from the ground and saw a need a demand that consumers had, and they began to address it. And now you see the larger industry players at least begin in principle to bring change as well. The same thing needs to happen in this sector. And the only way to make that happen is to encourage new actors to come in to lend support to new actors, whether they're jewelers or, again, as Fairphone, not in the jewelry industry, but rather the electronics industry. And that's where our focus is, not just creating jewelers, say in Europe or North America, but focusing on creating jewelers locally. Where's that gold coming from? Why can't that jewelry be made here in Kenya or in Uganda or the DRC? And it's only by leading by that example, we can accept these risks face on. So that's where I'll leave it today. Thank you, Candace.
Thank you, Matthew. Next, we'll be having my colleague at the Impact Facility, Mr. David Stamms, who's the Director of Program and Operations at the Impact Facility. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Candace. And thanks, Joshua, Matthew, and Jason for your presentations. All three of you touched on different themes that result in, I think, a similar realization that we need to look at artisanal mining and see how that can be improved through training and capacity building. But Joshua pointed out the miners are interested in accessing equipment and working with more equipment. We heard from Matthew that we need to look at both production volumes, but also the efficiency of miners, rather than focusing or obsessing about price points and seeing if we can squeeze out a 2 or 3% premium, because the inefficiencies we are looking at are economic realities that miners are sometimes left with a profit margin of anywhere between 5 and 20%, but that's a wide range from just preliminary studies and surveys that we've done with miners. And a lot of the costs, the biggest costs are around labor costs and just the inefficiencies of not having machines. And if you introduce the right machines, we could come up with cost savings that at the same time address health and safety hazards that we're currently facing. Crushing stones without goggles and then with normal hammers or bigger rocks is just the easiest way on how to just damage your thumb or your fingers as you're doing this. Climbing up and down mine shafts with bags of ore on your back, rather than having a winch, which is much more efficient and in moving volume, is a huge hazard, because you can the miners can fall, they can drop stones or ore on other people. And so as we look at mine sites for investment potential and saying what machines could be introduced to bring down costs per unit produced and at the same time boost the number of units that are being produced, this is when we can create a more profitable product for the miners, rather than trying to ignore the production side and then argue whether somebody's willing to pay a premium to the miners. Because if we listen to Matthew carefully, we might still need that premium for supply chain integration. There might still be a higher cost to actually integrate it into the supply chain, which could hopefully be just the product of small volumes. And so as we scale these systems, economies of scale would kick in, and those transport and integration costs hopefully would also even out, and that's what we're currently exploring. but it's not like there's no machines at all. There are machines. We have different investors. Joshua mentioned mine sites that work with excavators, but often these are provided by third-party investors, local or foreign, coming in and either through production sharing agreements or by providing informal loans. And these loans can have returns higher than 100%, but production sharing agreements could equally result in what we've seen in Uganda, reimbursement of costs plus 50% of all profits. And then suddenly the mining groups or individual miners end up with crumbs of a potentially bigger pie. But the idea is to turn that around again and see, even if the pie is initially a bit smaller, or if we structure it differently, the ownership and the benefit needs to be with the local community. So we looked at this as really the key differentiator for where we can add value, and explored over the last 5 years on how can we provide equipment, running a couple of pilots doing so. And the learning here is miners are willing to pay for equipment. They're eager to work and enter into partnerships. They seek transparency and really want to work together. And Joshua described the same thing. They're willing to engage in trainings and tick all the boxes in order to qualify for this. While there are some, admittedly so, that have been somewhat spoiled by the idea of NGOs bringing grant financed machines or equipment. And so we've encountered challenges around that as well. But the majority of mine sites is eager to hear out commercial proposals on how they could access financing, and they just dare you to invest and see that they will repay as such. And the existence of informal finance deals that are currently in place show that they are profitable enough to pay financing under fairly bad terms, and they are fairly reliable in repaying that as well. And so we now need formal actors to make a step forward and take a leap of faith that this would also work in a more formal setting. If we go to the next slide, we can see some of the terms that we then think about as we are looking at the provision of equipment through the Lake Victoria Gold Program, specifically through the Impact Facility and its local entity, and then Kenya, and then later also in Uganda. We believe that rather than providing loans as the default option or product, we might much rather look at equipment leasing, because equipment leasing doesn't put an organization into immediate debt, and it provides you security from a financing perspective that you can withdraw the asset if and when the needs of the miners change or the miners default on the payment, either on purpose or because of external factors that are difficult to control. As such, we can take out the generator, the water pump, whatever has been given on lease, and find another mine, redeploy the same asset, and manage the financial risk of these investments. That's not just a theoretical assumption at this point. We had cases of leasing out generators to mine sites. They defaulted, and then within the same groups, a couple of months later, they said, we now were able to resolve our governance issues, and we'd like to access the same generator again and continue repaying the generator as before. There's costs with these transactions, putting things into storage and doing maintenance on them, but it is possible, and something that we've seen in the agricultural sector and in any other number of industrial sectors, where leasing is one way to resolve liquidity issues that don't allow miners to invest themselves or individual producers to invest upfront, but allow them to then access higher productivity, higher efficiency, and repay that over time. What we've seen is that as we structure such deals, we need to engage in business and business literacy training. Bookkeeping is a key starting point for us, for miners to understand their profit and loss and where their biggest expenses are. So that those things that are most expensive now are reviewed first and seeing, can we address them? Can we try to solve these as well? While it's great to work with cooperatives to give as many people as possible the benefit of these machines that we bring, it's also extremely important to have a clear counterpart. This is to safeguard the equipment, if you give responsibility to a group as such, everybody feels entitled to use it and nobody feels responsible to maintain. And so it's important that there's clear structures in place on who should be the recipient or who's responsible for this. And then that could result in group access to the machines, but that just needs to be clearly defined. From a payment perspective, past contracts and future contracts have included grace periods so that miners can start using the equipment, depending on whether it's a 1-year lease or a 2-year lease, for 1 to 3 months before they need to start paying back. That allows them to really learn how to use these machines efficiently and build up some reserves before they start paying back. Even with a grace period, things can happen in mining. So heavy rains, accidents, tunnel collapses that require immediate attention and also immediate investment that might distract from repaying a water pump or a generator. And so not to risk that we would have to withdraw assets then, we have built into our systems now payment breaks that would allow miners to proactively communicate their difficulty in meeting a payment target for a specific month. And then twice a year say, this month we are not going to do this. And maybe next month we'll pay double, or even just put the payment that they skip to the end of the repayment period. And again, from a risk management perspective, not starting with a cyanidation plant up front and investing $150,000 as the first thing we do, but saying what is the smallest possible investment that can have the biggest possible impact for you. And here, coming back to Candice's previous question and Joshua's recommendation, looking at crushing, we can target also vulnerable groups within cooperative structures or within the mines and see how can we make working conditions that are untenable more tenable, or turn them into decent working conditions by introducing machines where the ownership of those machines is to the benefit of the vulnerable groups that we would like to support. And then the last point before we might go to the Q&A, Candice, we need to think beyond the initial provision of equipment about maintenance and spare parts. Because with a lot of the machines that are currently bought, set aside that they're low quality, if they're cheap imports from China mainly, spare parts are an issue for any more complex machine. And so we are now working with our team and different experts from partner organizations to make sure that the equipment that we propose and provide is serviceable and that the spare parts are available and are factored into the planning from the beginning so that there's no surprises later down the road. And with this, Candice, on the next slide, we really believe that through all the partners that we bring to the Lake Victoria Gold Program, we have what it needs to break the cycle of poverty, of low profits leading to low mechanization, leading to low production, and inability to export or reaching the formal market. And so the Lake Victoria Gold Program is really trying to attach itself to all 4 of these points through capacity building, trying to build the technical skills, unlocking the production potential by introducing machines once they pass basic due diligence and ESG requirements, and then boosting production volumes that would allow organizations like the Chambers Federation to broker between organizations exports to the international market, where there's a value add from a miner's perspective, because the national market might be more lucrative to begin with if we set up the structures the right way. And yeah, with this, we have 5 minutes left, Candice.
Okay, so if we could move on to the Q&A session. There's a question here addressed to Mr. Joshua. Would you be able to elaborate on the mentioned shortcomings of traceability systems? I see that Joshua is typing an answer. And the second question is addressed to Mr. Matthew Chambers. Matthew mentioned that 2 to 5% discount off of the AU price for miners, but do the local informal buyers take an unfairly purity discount? What about the losses in gold, etc., in the refined products? In Colombia, we're seeing losses to small-scale miners in the sales chains of 10 to 25% factoring in the above. So, Matthew, would you be able to address the question addressed to you?
Yes, of course. I actually began typing, but I figured it'd be better to speak about it. It's a great question, James. Literally just drove back from the field yesterday, and a couple of days before, we had met with some informal traders and viewed how they were buying. What they didn't know is that we had our own equipment with as well. And so I wouldn't say that there's an unfair discount. Again, from our experience in Kenya and in Congo, I wouldn't say that there's an unfair discount on purity. Rather, most traders are starting at or near market price, and miners, everyone along the supply chain has access to Kitco. This was even our experience 13 years ago when we first started in Western Kenya, that everybody had kitco.com on their phone and knew what the market price. And quite often there was a lack of understanding on what the purity of the material that they were extracting from the ground was. And so what we've seen most traders do is say, oh, we'll pay you market price, but then they're altering their machines. And so we actually caught one of the largest traders in Western Kenya doing exactly that, where they were using a water displacement device to test the purity. And then we stepped in and said, oh, that's right, we've got our XRF in the vehicle. Let's bring that in here and compare our analysis to yours. And it was a 2.5% difference. And so I think that's how many traders are working the system, so to speak, to I don't want to use the word cheating, but yes, they're cheating to make their margin. But what was the other? Oh, in context of silver. So even on the refining side, many refiners won't pay on silver content, and not saying that every dollar doesn't count, but unless you're talking about miners that are producing a very large volume, you're talking about very, very small amount of value for that silver. Now, that being said, we do try to find a system to add that silver payout from the refiners we work with back into supporting miners in whatever program that we're working. That can quite often be difficult because we can't identify 8% silver content from this 1 gram sample here and 15% silver content from this one over here. So it's more of a mass balance approach, but it is fair, absolutely, to include that in some form of a payout, but that's not the standard from what we've seen, because wherever those traders are taking their gold, they're also not receiving payment.
I see that the other question, Joshua was able to answer it.
Yeah, yes, Candice. I also started typing, and along the way, I figured I would answer it directly. Okay. The shortcomings that traceability faces, the main shortcoming, in my view, is that most traceability mechanisms have limited access to base information, basically the geographical location of the mines, where the minerals are coming from, considering how artisanal miners operate, very mobile and loosely regulated, and sometimes in some instances operating in very hard to reach areas, like in the middle of a jungle in Congo. So you end up with a scenario where, I'll give an example. So there's a while back, there was a report of coltan being tagged as from Congo, but on export, they found the same batch of coltan was tagged as from Rwanda. So it gives you a clear challenge, because if you can't trace the physical location of where the mineral has been extracted, at the end of the day, by the time gold goes through 2 or 3 refinements, the chemical structure has been changed and you can't really trace where exactly it was produced. The other challenge is countries where mining is happening, integrating traceability mechanisms into their laws. In Eastern Africa, there is the ICGLR, International Conference of the Great Lakes Region. They are trying to put up a traceability mechanism, but for example, Uganda, who is a signatory, hasn't integrated it into their law, meaning it actually brings into question the authenticity of the volumes that Bank of Uganda declares every year as Ugandan gold exports.
Thank you, Joshua. I hope the question has been answered. And with this, I think we can come to the end of our session today. I'd like our panelists to say one or two things as we come to the closing. Can we start with Mr. Stamps, David Stamps?
Well, thanks everyone for participating and listening in. I'm fairly excited about the prospect of working on this and working based on a lot of learnings that were hard earned, I think, between different partners. But I think what stands out with our approach, or maybe it doesn't stand out, but what's important or core to our approach, that it's miner centric. So thinking about miners as almost as customers or clients. So as we engage them, what are the trainings they're interested in and that would benefit their business? If we design a supply chain, do we do this for the downstream or for the miners? And then the clarity follows here. Let's see that there is benefit to the miners to do so. And the same with the leasing. Is the equipment that we are bringing in to the benefit of individuals on the ground? Does it make them safer at work, and it does boost productivity? So I think this is really important, because it's not about compliance as such. It's really about building structures that could last way beyond the 2024 expiry date of the program. And so hopefully in the years to come, we can have updates on how we are progressing, and hopefully the enthusiasm now is not going to be much different in the years to come from myself.
Thank you, David. Joshua, any last words?
My last words would be that I'm thrilled to be a part of this team, and maybe what I would like to say is that we need to, first of all, unlearn some of the stereotypes that have been branded onto ASMs for us to better serve them as people, because at the end of the day, these are lives of actual people like any of us that we are going to be working with and helping and supporting. So once we approach it with an open mind, there is no limit to what we can do. Yeah.
Matthew?
Right. Well, Joshua and David already said the best parts here. So let me just say what they said, but in a different way. Right. These are people. These, artisanal mining has been often looked upon with questionable eyes for many, many years. And that's unfair, right? There's no difference in between somebody digging in their own land, in their own backyard, in their own neighborhood. There's no difference in between them benefiting from their own natural resources than a farmer who's growing cocoa, a farmer who's growing coffee. And in many areas where you find artisanal gold, you will find people that are cross-sector, that are both mining and farming at the same time. So remember, the reason why we should all be here is the focus on those people, that we need to be willing to accept risks. And for those that know us, yes, we definitely accept a lot of risk. But right, that's what I would leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. We have to wrap up the session. 60 minutes is done, but thank you to the panelists. It was a pleasure having you on here. Thank you to everybody who joined and logged into the session. Remember, you will receive a recording of this session, and if you have any more questions, they will be addressed to via email. And have a great weekend, everybody. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.